Not everyone who dies and comes back sees light. Some see darkness. Absolute, crushing darkness. Others find themselves in landscapes of ash and torment, surrounded by entities that feel malevolent, trapped in a loop of their own worst moments. And here's what almost no one talks about. These experiences are just as real, just as transformative, and just as documented as the blissful ones. But there's something about the dark near-death experiences that researchers discovered. Something that completely changes what we think they mean. And I'm going to show you, by the end of this video, why the darkness might be the most important teacher of all. Stay with me. We love near-death experience stories, the tunnel of light, the deceased relatives waiting with open arms, the overwhelming sense of unconditional love, the life review that feels like wisdom itself. These narratives have shaped modern spirituality, given comfort to millions, and fundamentally altered how we think about death. But there's a shadow side to the near-death phenomenon that gets buried, dismissed, or explained away. And it's more common than you think. Studies suggest that somewhere between 10 and 23% of near-death experiences are distressing, not peaceful, not transcendent, distressing. We're talking about experiences of void, complete emptiness where the self dissolves into nothingness, experiences of hellish imagery, fire, torture, demonic figures, and perhaps most haunting, experiences of life review gone wrong, where instead of compassion, there's only crushing shame and judgment. Dr. Nancy Evans Bush spent decades documenting these cases. She herself had a terrifying NDE and found almost no literature acknowledging it existed. The testimonies she collected are chilling. One person described being pulled downward into what felt like an abyss of screaming voices. Another found themselves in a gray wasteland, utterly alone, with the sense that this would last forever. A third encountered beings that radiated hostility and rage. These aren't edge cases. These aren't hallucinations dismissed by serious researchers. These are documented, consistent, cross-cultural reports that appear in the same literature as the blissful NDEs. The difference, we don't talk about them because they're inconvenient, because they complicate the narrative, because they scare us. And here's the question that haunts anyone who looks closely at this. If near-death experiences are glimpses of the afterlife, does it mean that some people go to hell? If you're still with me, you're ready to go deeper than most people are willing to go. This channel exists to explore the uncomfortable truths about consciousness, death, and what lies beyond the materialist paradigm. Hit subscribe, because what I'm about to show you will reframe everything you thought you knew about the afterlife. Let's get specific. Distressing near-death experiences fall into 3 broad categories, and understanding them is critical to understanding what they actually mean. 1. The void. This is the experience of absolute nothingness. Not peaceful emptiness, annihilating emptiness. Experiencers describe losing all sense of self, all sense of meaning, floating in a black expanse where nothing exists and nothing ever will. Some say it feels like being erased. Others call it the worst loneliness imaginable. There's no torture, no demons, just the horror of non-being. One experiencer said, "I wasn't in hell, I was nowhere, and that was worse." 2. The Hellscape. This is the one that matches religious imagery: fire, darkness, beings that feel evil, landscapes of suffering. Some experiencers report seeing others in torment, screaming, writhing, trapped. Others describe being attacked, judged, or humiliated by entities they can't escape. The emotional tone is always the same: terror, hopelessness, and the sense that this is a punishment. A cardiac arrest survivor recalled, "I was in a place that felt like hatred made solid. Everything there wanted me to suffer, and I understood in that moment that I deserved it." 3's The Life Review Gone Dark. In positive NDEs, the life review is compassionate. You see your actions from others' perspectives, feel the pain you caused, but you're held in love and understanding. In dark NDEs, the life review is a tribunal. Every lie, every cruelty, every moment of cowardice, played back in excruciating detail with no mercy, no context, no forgiveness. Just the weight of it all crushing you. One person described it as being forced to experience every hurt I ever caused, but amplified 1,000 times with the knowledge that I was fundamentally broken. Now here's where it gets interesting. These experiences are not random. Researchers have found patterns. Distressing NDEs are more common in people who were struggling with guilt, shame, fear, or inner conflict before the event. They're more common in sudden violent deaths. And they're more common in people who had rigid fear-based religious beliefs. But, and this is critical, they also happen to people with none of those factors, which means we can't simply write them off as psychological projections. So what are they? Here's the thing almost no one tells you. Distressing near-death experiences don't stay distressing. Follow-up studies show that people who have dark NDEs often undergo profound spiritual transformation. In fact, some researchers argue that the distressing NDE can be even more transformative than the blissful one, because it forces a confrontation with the shadow, with the parts of the self that were buried, denied, or running the show unconsciously. Dr. Bruce Grayson, one of the most respected NDE researchers in the world, found that people who had hellish NDEs and later integrated the experience reported the same outcomes as people with positive NDEs. Reduced fear of death, increased sense of meaning, greater compassion, and a fundamental reorientation toward what matters in life. The darkness, in other words, wasn't a punishment, it was a mirror. Let me say that again. The darkness wasn't a punishment, it was a mirror. This is the key insight that reframes everything. Near-death experiences, whether light or dark, are not objective places you go to. They're states of consciousness. They're phenomenological landscapes generated by the intersection of your mind, your beliefs, your unresolved traumas, and whatever larger reality lies beyond the brain. The void? That's the terror of ego dissolution. The fear that without your identity, there is nothing. The hellscape? That's the externalization of inner torment, the guilt and shame you've been carrying made visible. The harsh life review? That's the confrontation with truth that the ego has been avoiding. And here's the most important part. These experiences are not eternal. They're transitional. They're stages of a process. Almost everyone who survives a distressing NDE and has time to process it describes moving through the darkness into something else: acceptance, understanding, even peace. One survivor put it beautifully. Hell wasn't a place I was sent to. It was a place I was trapped in by my own mind. And the moment I stopped fighting it, the moment I let go, it dissolved. This aligns with mystical traditions across the world. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes wrathful deities and terrifying visions that appear after death, but they're explicitly described as projections of your own mind, tests you must recognize and move through. The Christian mystic spoke of the dark night of the soul, a harrowing descent that precedes union with the divine. Even modern psychedelic research shows that the most difficult, terrifying trips often lead to the most healing. The pattern is clear. Consciousness, when confronted with its own depths, generates terror before it generates transcendence. So if you die and find yourself in darkness, if you find yourself in what feels like hell, what you're experiencing is not God's judgment. It's not eternal damnation. It's the clearing of the psyche. It's the burning away of what was false. It's the confrontation with the truth you've been avoiding your entire life. And yes, it's excruciating, but it's also temporary. So what do we do with this? First, we stop dividing near-death experiences into real and not real based on whether they're pleasant. All of them are real experiences. All of them tell us something about the nature of consciousness and what happens when the brain's filters are removed. Second, we recognize that the content of the experience, whether light or dark, reflects the state of consciousness of the experiencer. Not as punishment, but as revelation. If you carry unresolved guilt, unprocessed trauma, or rigid fear-based beliefs, those will likely shape the initial landscape you encounter, but they don't define the final destination. Third, we understand that integration is everything. The NDE itself, light or dark, is just the beginning. What matters is what you do with it afterward. Do you allow it to crack you open? Do you face what it showed you? Or do you retreat back into the patterns that created the darkness in the first place? And finally, we apply this to how we live now, because you don't need to die to encounter your inner hell. Most people are walking through it every day, trapped in loops of shame, fear, and self-judgment, convinced this is just who they are. The lesson of the dark NDE is this: you are not your darkness. You're the awareness that can witness it. And when you stop running from it, when you turn toward it with courage and compassion, it loses its power. It transforms. It becomes wisdom. The hell is not out there, waiting for you after death. The hell is in the unlived life, in the refusal to face yourself, in the belief that you are fundamentally broken, and the way out is through. If this video changed how you see death, consciousness, or the parts of yourself you've been avoiding, do me a favor. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because this conversation, the real conversation about what happens when we die, is only just beginning. And maybe, just maybe, the darkness you fear is the doorway you've been looking for all along.